quiz that should be fun, so please check those out and take them with you. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Foglesong. He's been with us before, so he's not a stranger to most of you. Dr. Foglesong is an expert on Florida and U.S. politics, new urbanism, and the politics of urban development, Hispanic politics, and the history of Walt Disney World. He holds the George and Harriet Cornell Chair in Politics at Rollins, where he also teaches, and he's also an author. So please welcome Dr. Foglesong, who will introduce
Thank you. And Dr. Foglesong is also recently retired. It feels good. You're going to have a great program today, but then you already know that. That's why there's so very many of you here. It's a pleasure for me to introduce your speaker, Dr. Vikram Amar, Dean Amar, I should say, who is the Dean of the Law School at the University of Illinois, where he also holds a chair in law, the Iwan Professorship at the University of Illinois. Before coming to Illinois in 2015, he was Associate Dean at the Law School at the University of California at Davis. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of California at Berkeley and his law degree at Yale University. He's an eminent authority on constitutional law, the federal courts, and civil procedure. He's produced several books on those topics and over 50 law review articles in various law reviews. He also writes a regular column on legal education and constitutional issues. This, by the way, is the pedigree of a future Supreme Court justice. You've heard it here, you heard it from me, maybe not first, but you've heard it from me. And if that happens, he will know the way to the roving room because he was a clerk at the Supreme Court for Justice Harry Blackmun. Some people know in this room, know the family at least. In fact, he was the first person of South Asian descent to clerk on the Supreme Court, and also the first American-born person of Indian heritage to lead a major law school. Now, this is not an academic symposium, of course, and like the League of Women Voters, Dean Amar is someone who is no stranger to the public square, who's taken a position on issues of importance, in particular the question of what to do about American elections and what to do in particular about the state-by-state process whereby we elect our President of the United States. For generations, professors like myself have told students that the way we do it in America is a fait accompli, a tragic one, but one that we can't escape, not without a constitutional amendment. What's interesting about the presentation you're going to hear today, among other things, is that Dean Amar says that there is a workaround that we could use. He calls it sub-constitutional, meaning a way to do it differently without resorting to a constitutional amendment. I'm sure everybody in this room remembers the Equal Rights Amendment fight. Yeah, and doesn't want to go through that again. So please help me welcome Dean Amar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rick. That may be the nicest and most sophisticated introduction I've ever received. So I really appreciate that. I also want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank Patty and Kathleen and Leslie and Gloria and Lisa and others for bringing me here. It's indeed my pleasure to be before you to talk a little bit about this important topic. So why don't we begin in 2000 and of course the Bush versus Gore election in which Florida featured so prominently, and ask or talk a little bit about how that singular event began to get people thinking, as Rick mentioned, about how we can move in the direction of something that seems quite intuitively attractive to most people, namely the winner of the most votes in the United States should be the President of the United States. It's not really that complicated an idea that everybody's vote throughout the country should count equally as against everybody else's vote. So I think the starting place really has to be not what reform might look like today. The starting place has to be why we have an electoral college in the first place. Where did it come from? How did it come about? Now, when the founders created the Constitution, the one thing they did not want for their chief executive was a king. They had experience with a king. That didn't work out. They did not want royalty. They did not want dynasty. That, by the way, is why George Washington was so obviously the best pick for the first president. In addition to being a great general and a smart guy and a guy of good character, he also had no sons. He had no male heirs. So there was no concern that he would give the presidency to his sons and turn it into a monarchy. So how do we pick a president? Well, one way you could pick a chief executive is the way that Europe does, through a parliamentary system, where the legislature elects the chief executive. But the framers consciously wanted Congress and the president to be in some tension with each other. That was part of the separation of powers design. They did not want the president to be dependent on popularity in Congress, so they instead created an apparatus that used the states rather than the Congress to pick the president. So this is Article 2, Section 1, that describes the guts of the Constitution's description of the Electoral College. That every state has a certain number of electors that's equal to its House members and its Senate members. And the state legislature prescribes how those electors in each state are selected. And then after they're selected, they meet in their respective states and they cast ballots now for president and vice president. There are a lot of myths about why the Electoral College came to the form that it did. So when you're in grade school, you'll learn that the Electoral College is all about distrust of democracy, and that people didn't want there to be an election because we didn't trust people to have an election and reach the right result. And yet, if that were true, then you wouldn't have this provision, which was the most democratic provision of its kind in the world at the time the Constitution was created, and that is allowing people to vote directly for the representatives in the House of Representatives, which, by the way, was thought to be the most important body in the newly created government by the Constitution. Not only that, we got rid of property qualifications for voting eligibility for the House. The reality is, in 1787, you could not have a presidential election the way you could have a House election. Why? Because you have no telegraph, you have no trains, you have no way of maintaining a national campaign. There were no political parties in 1787. There were people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution and those who favored it, but they weren't full-fledged political parties. So you simply could not have had an election. By 1800, you could have had one. If any of you have seen Hamilton, you know that by 1800, there are very robust, energetic national parties. There's the party headed by Thomas Jefferson and the party headed by John Adams. And so the question lurks, why did we not have a move to direct election by the time of 1800 when we actually amended the Constitution so as to preserve the Electoral College? That was a fork in the road. We could have gotten rid of it right after 1800, but we kept it instead of getting rid of it. And the reason we did is, like a lot of things about the original Constitution, it's about slavery. So we see that at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, James Wilson, probably the most sophisticated lawyer among the founders, Pennsylvanian, a very prominent legal scholar in the day, he proposed that there be a national direct election. But James Madison, so-called father of the Constitution, a Virginian, he said, look, the South is not going to adopt the Constitution if you have a national popular election for president. Why? Because they'll lose, and they're worried about losing slavery. Why does the Electoral College help preserve slavery? Because remember, the formula for the Electoral College is you get a number of electors in each state equal to how many House seats you have and how many Senate seats you have. Every state has 2 senators. That's equal across the country. But the number of House seats you have depends on your population. Today, it depends on how many people you have. Back then, it depended on how many free people you had, plus 3/5 of how many slaves you had. The so-called 3/5 compromise. Okay? So that meant that southern states got extra credit in the House of Representatives for their slave population, and therefore they had more votes in the Electoral College, even though they had fewer free voters. So Pennsylvania is the state that has the most voters, but Virginia has 20% more electors. Which is why, for the first 36 years after the Constitution, for 32 of those 36 years, a slave-owning Virginian is president. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Only John Adams broke that up. It's no coincidence. In 1800, when Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams in the rematch, Adams had beaten Jefferson in 1796, magazines, newspapers all across the country wrote about how Jefferson literally rode into the White House on the backs of slaves. Without the extra credit Virginia got for having slaves, Jefferson never would have won. So, and it's not just about racism. There were people even back in the early 1800s, late 1700s, who thought women should be allowed to vote.
No.
And yet, notice how the Electoral College makes it costless for a state to deprive women the right to vote. If you're a state in 1800 and you have a national popular vote, you increase your state's clout by allowing women to vote. And you double your population. If you have the Electoral College and you get the same number of electors either way, what incentive do you have to liberalize and allow women to vote? It made it easy to maintain the disenfranchisement of women by imposing no costs on it. And there was a sexist strain in people who supported the Electoral College, just as slavery drove a lot of it. Okay? So, I think we have to ask, is something that is born of dubious origin, of dubious rationale, is it something that we should nonetheless maintain today? Sometimes we do good things for the wrong reasons. We do things that make sense for reasons that were not so laudable. And the question is that true for the Electoral College today? So there's a lot of arguments that people make in favor of Electoral College as opposed to a national popular vote. One of them has to do with the idea that regionally, we don't want a president who's popular in some parts of the country but not other parts. And an Electoral College kind of guarantees national popularity in a way that national popular vote wouldn't, because you could just win big in a few states and therefore get into the White House. That argument doesn't work for two reasons. First of all, to win a national popular vote, you have to have a national campaign. There's no way that you can be intensely unpopular in wide swaths of the country and still win the national popular vote. But more importantly, if you look at elections over U.S. history, there's regionalism in all of them, right? This is not the election of 2000. It looks a lot like that one, doesn't it? This is 1896 or 1900. This is Brian McKinley. Notice the red and blue get inverted here, but you still have the same regional blocks. Go back to 2000. Only New Mexico, and I guess maybe New Hampshire, only 2 states don't touch another state of the same color. It's not a checkerboard, it's not a random distribution. It's red and blue regions. Happily, though, it turns out that even in the reddest of regions, the Democrat still gets 40%. And in the bluest of regions, the Republican gets 40%. Why? Because political party, more than geography, is the salient factor in American politics today. And more so now even than in 2000, as we see every single day. So I don't think you have to worry that a president elected in a national popular vote is going to lack credibility in certain parts of the country in a way that's not true for the electoral. Abraham Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in the South. He won the election. He was not on the ballot in any state in the South. Okay? So I don't think that's a reason. Another reason people sometimes give is we want to discourage third-party candidates. And an electoral college does that more than a national popular vote. Turns out, if you look at the biggest states, New York, Texas, California, I don't know about Florida, I just looked at those three when they were the biggest on the scene. Turns out that governor elections in all those states tend to have smaller third-party influence than national presidential elections. People go back to 2000. What cost Gore the election? Well, Ralph Nader cost Gore the election.
That's right.
Everyone in this room knows that.
That's right.
Think back to George Wallace. Think back to John Anderson. Think back to Ross Perot.
Ross Perot.
Okay? It's not as if we don't have third parties under presidential elections. In fact, we have more of them than we have third parties for gubernatorial elections in California and Texas and New York, which are nations unto themselves. California has as many people as the United States did until the Civil War. Okay? It's a nation state. And notice that no state in the country would even think about, even if it was constitutionally permissible, which it's not, no state in the country would even think about how electing its governor by some cockamamie scheme like a statewide electoral college where every county gets a certain number of votes into a statewide formula. And we, as Rick was saying earlier this morning, we don't export the electoral college to democracies around the world that we are trying to help develop their traditions. So, again, you have to ask, what is it that is good about this system? Why do we want to keep it? Another big concern people have is, well, even if we want to, starting from scratch, if we move to a direct national vote today, it's a power play for the Democratic Party, and it will hurt the Republicans. And you can't do something, even if it otherwise would be a good thing, you can't do it with that kind of partisan motivation, that kind of partisan implication. A few points about that. More of the analysts that I saw leading into the 2000 election thought that Gore was going to win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote than the other way around. More people thought that Bush was going to win the popular vote and yet lose in the Electoral College. Okay. In the election of 2004, 4 years later, George W. Bush drugged John Kerry nationally. 3.5 million votes or so. It was not close. And yet, if Ohio, this is the results in Ohio, if 60,000 people had voted the other way in Ohio, John Kerry would be president, would have been president. So it could have easily burned the Republicans in 2004, just as it burned Democrats in 2000. And I use the word burn advisedly here, because, you know, President Trump exaggerates about some things. But one of the things that he says that's actually true is that we don't know that he wouldn't have won the popular vote in 2016. Of course, that's the second election other than the election 2000 in our memories, where there was a divergence between the popular vote winner and the Electoral College winner. But maybe Trump would have won the popular vote if that had been the rule in place at the time of the election. You play according to the rules of the game that are present when the game starts. Trump had no incentive to run up the score in the Deep South or to dampen the margin of loss in New York and California. Because it didn't matter. He was going to lose New York and California under the Electoral College. He could have won a few more votes in New York and California, and maybe a few more votes in the Deep South, but it didn't matter. So we don't know who will win the popular election. We are at a moment in history where it's not remotely clear which party this benefits. Maybe if Republicans alienate Latinx folks, that they'll lose the popular vote going forward. But who knows? Maybe they'll start to get more of those votes. And if you were really worried about the partisan gamesmanship of this, fine, then support NPV with a time lag. Say it won't take effect for 8 or 12 years after the requisite number of states come on board. That way you don't have any visibility about which party will be held. Think of how quickly things change. 8 and 12 years is an eternity when it comes to party dynamics. Okay. So where are we in this NPV business? Well, again, just the basics. NPV takes advantage of and I use that word not in a kind of a pejorative sense, it acknowledges that the latitude each state has to pick its electors however they want to. Most every state says rationally, we'll give our electors, all of them, the big bucket of 29, we'll give them to the candidate who wins the most votes in our state, the most popular candidate in our state. And by the way, it makes sense that every state has gone winner take all, except for Nebraska and Maine for bizarre reasons, and they don't really matter that much. But think about Florida. If Florida said to the world, we'll give our 29 electors in proportion to the popular vote, that means one candidate is always going to get 15 and the other one's going to get 14. Who would come campaign in Florida? Who cares? I spend billions of dollars and all my time and all my promises in Florida to pick up one elector. But if Florida says, we'll give you all 29 if you win over our median voter, you win over the few thousand people in the middle, and you get up to all 29, that's an incentive for people to take Florida seriously. That's why places like Florida benefit from the current system. Who are the losers in the current system? Every state other than a decent-sized swing state. Small states don't benefit from the electoral college. They think they do, but look at it. Presidents don't come from small states. Only Bill Clinton came from a small state in recent times. They all come from big states. Candidates don't campaign and make promises in small states. They make promises in decent-sized purple swing states. Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Virginia. That's who benefits under the current system. Who loses? California loses, but Texas loses just as much. Candidates come to Texas and California to get money, but they don't make promises that really matter to Texans or Californians. They don't promise programs that are going to redound to their benefit. They might happen to kind of coincide with some of those states, but that's not California, Texas, New York, big red, big blue states, solidly red and solidly blue states. Those are the ones left out of this game. It all comes down to 10, 12 so-called decent-sized swing states. So that was the impetus for an idea that my older brother, who's a law professor at Yale, and I, and a third person who was working separately, the former dean of the Northwestern Law School, which is 2 hours north of my law school in Champaign-Urbana. We were writing in 2001 some articles about how this could come about. And my brother and I in particular posited this interstate compact idea that we were throwing out there just kind of to show we were clever and we thought about some things. We did not expect anyone to raise money and then go out and shop this idea. And John Koza and the folks who run with this concept, they haven't done things exactly as I would have encouraged them. They've consulted with us over the years, but I think it could have been done a little differently. But as things stand now, 11 states plus the District of Columbia have signed on to an agreement whereby they will give their electors not to the candidate who wins the most votes in their state, but to the candidate who wins the most votes nationwide. So that means that someone could win, if Florida joined the NPV, that Florida would give its 29 electors to the person who wins the most votes nationwide, regardless of who edged out whom in Florida. Okay? And this doesn't take effect until enough states that make up a majority of the Electoral College have joined the agreement. So there's no unilateral disarmament, so to speak. The state is not committing to doing anything until you reach the magic number of 270 electors. Right now they're at 172, 11 states plus the District of Columbia, and you see Colorado is slightly shaded because both houses of the legislature in Colorado have passed it, and any day now the governor will sign it. So Colorado will add 9 more votes, and that will become the next state. Now, Colorado is particularly important for 3 reasons. First of all, if you look at the states that have adopted it, they're all blue states, which again feeds this perception, this wrong perception, that popular vote helps Democrats and the Electoral College helps Republicans. It's not true, but it's hard to dislodge people of that myth when the only states that have joined it are blue states. Colorado is a purple state. So to get to a red state, maybe you have to first win over a purple state. Interestingly though, purple states, especially decent-sized purple states like Ohio and Florida and Colorado, they have selfish reasons for wanting to keep with the current regime because they get all the love. So for Colorado to do this, it's going to be very important, both because it's a non-blue state, and it shows this is not just about Dems, It's a state that is doing something in the name of principle, even though there's a selflessness involved, because they're giving up some clout that they otherwise have. And then third and most important, after the governor signs it, there'll be a referendum on the ballot in Colorado where the people get to weigh in directly on this. Okay? States west of the Mississippi make use of direct democracy. I know Florida has some of it. It's not so common in the upper Midwest and New England. But if you're going to get a red state to break through, and you've got to have a red state to break through or this thing won't fly, you'll never get to 270, and you'll never overcome the perception that it's all partisan. It won't survive in the courts if people have that perception. You've got to get some red states to join. And again, red states like Texas should want to join because they're left out of the party right now. They're left out of the game. But the only way to get a red state to join, I think, in the foreseeable future is through direct democracy. Why? Because elected legislators are much more opposed to this measure than rank-and-file Republican voters. So take a state like Arizona or Oklahoma, pretty solidly red states, where the legislature doesn't want any part of this. The people, even Republicans, support it. So places like Arizona and Oklahoma that have direct democracy, that's how you break through. So when the Colorado voters affirm it, and I hope they do, that will show that the people can have a voice in this, not just the state legislatures, and the Supreme Court will uphold the use of the initiative in this regard. Patty and I were talking about that earlier. 4 years ago, there was a case out of Arizona, an issue near and dear to those of you here in Florida, redistricting. So fed up with gerrymandering and incumbent entrenchment, the voters of Arizona passed a measure that takes the job of drawing district lines away from the elected legislature and gives it to an independent citizen commission. California has done the same thing. I know moves in that direction in Florida have been considered. The elected legislator in Arizona had the chutzpah to sue the state, saying, you can't take this job away from us. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 vote, with Justice Ginsburg writing a very good opinion, said, when the Constitution says the legislatures of the states get to decide how to draw district lines, the legislature can include the people acting directly. And if that's true for Article 1 of the Constitution, which relates to congressional districting, that's true of Article 2 for the Constitution, which relates to selection of presidential electors. The word legislature has to mean the same thing in both of those settings. Now, this is an area where Justice Kennedy joined the more liberal justices to uphold that Arizona measure. Brett Kavanaugh, who went to law school with me, I don't know how he feels about this, but this could be an area, election reform. People talk about affirmative action, they talk about abortion, they talk about same-sex marriage. Election reform is an area where Kennedy was not quite solidly with all the conservatives. And John Roberts wrote a very angry, I think not very convincing dissent in this Arizona case. But it'll be very interesting to see how Brett feels about the use of direct democracy for election reform. So that's why I think the developments in Colorado in the next few weeks are going to be very interesting. Oregon is poised to enact it, and it's on the agenda in New Mexico as well. But after that, I mean, Delaware is the only other blue state that has not already been picked off. So you can get to around 200, but to get to 270, you're going to have to break through a red state. And if you do so in a smaller red state like Oklahoma or a mid-sized red state like Arizona, that will at least make it respectable for states like Texas to consider. Now, if Florida were to break through, that would be great. But again, in Florida, you have to overcome the fact that Florida benefits from the current system. You really have to make arguments that appeal to principle, because there is a bit of a self-sacrifice involved. That's why if Colorado, shows the way, then the slogan could be, look, if Colorado can do the right thing, Florida can too. Kathleen gave me some data this morning about how popular NPV is among the state's electorate, even if there's skepticism among especially Republican legislators and people in the governor's office. But Nancy Pelosi said something the other day, I can't remember what, I think it was the article that I read about how she's not in favor of impeachment. She said something, with popular sentiment on your side, nothing is impossible, and without it, you can't do a thing. So the reality is, if the people of a state want to do something, even the obstinate legislators will come around. I tell people it's like Jurassic Park. Democracy is like DNA. It finds a way around things. And let me mention how I became interested in this idea, because it illustrates that. I come from Illinois now. I took the job in part because I thought being the dean of the law school, the flagship law school in Abraham Lincoln's home state, would be a meaningful thing. Abraham Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas in 1858, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. They were debating over which of those two should be selected to be the U.S. Senator from Illinois. Right? It was a Senate debate. They weren't running for president yet. And you might say, well, why were they having these big debates in front of the people when it's the state legislatures that get to pick the senators? Remember, before the 17th Amendment, the Constitution says the senators are selected by the legislatures of the states. And yet, as early as the 1850s, Senate candidates were appealing to the people directly. Why is that? Because the people even then began to put pressure on the state legislatures to select as U.S. senators the candidates who were most favored by the people. That ripened into full-fledged forerunners of NPV in Oregon and Nebraska, where the state constitution was amended to require the legislature of Oregon to select as U.S. senator the people favored at the ballot box. So it's really that for people who say, oh, this is circumventing the Constitution, or this is that's what American democracy is. That's by the time the 17th Amendment was proposed by the House and the Senate for ratification to the states, a majority of U.S. senators were already directly elected. And you know that had to be the case, because otherwise the senators are never going to take the risk of proposing something that they don't know they can win at. Right? They're not going to change the way elections happen unless they know that they're going to be reelected under the new scheme. So, but NPV builds exactly on the track record of direct election of Senate, and that's a good history reminder for people to bear in mind as well. So, with that, let me turn it back over to, I guess, Rick. Are you next?
I'm waiting for the
Screen to be raised?
The screen to be raised.
screen to go up.
Not working.
What happened? You do it manually. I'm just looking for you.
Our mics are working? Yeah, I can hear mine work, right?
Yeah.
Great. So fire away, Rick.
Good talk, Professor.
Thank you.
I guess this is the Nick and Rick show here for just a little bit. So I've been asked to ask a few questions. And I thought I might start to get it out of the way with a question that was being posed in the news media as a lead up to the 2016 presidential election. And basically the question is, why now? Why get rid of the Electoral College now? The purpose of the Electoral College, after all, was to prevent people of bad character from ascending to the presidency. So why would we want to get rid of it now? Couldn't we use it rather than lose it? Haven't we recognized that populism is the problem, not the solution? That institutional safeguards on populism are what's needed, and that that unfaithful elector who would vote for someone other than the candidate who won in that state maybe is a hero rather than a scoundrel. In short, Should the League of Women Voters be encouraging states to adopt laws instructing their electors that they should vote for the person of good character who won the most votes in their state?
So I think it's an interesting question. Let me start by pointing out that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact Plan does not abolish the Electoral College. It just changes the way the electors are selected from the various states. But to the extent that the electors themselves are technically free agents who can vote for whomever they want for president, and as Rick points out, be faithless, that is, vote for someone other than the candidate that they pledged to support when they campaigned, when they were seeking to be chosen as an elector. That would remain part of this system unless and until you literally get rid of the Electoral College. And for that, I think you need a constitutional amendment. But my expectation is after a national popular vote, if it were to get up and running, after an election or two, then you would probably amend the Constitution in the same way that we amended the Constitution with the 17th Amendment to formalize a popular election of U.S. senators. After several elections when the U.S. senators were in effect already directly elected. So there's a process. The biggest question, Rick, that you ask is, is populism bad? That's the same argument that was made in opposing direct election of U.S. senators. The state legislators should be trusted. They can pick U.S. senators better than the people. The reality is, I don't think we've ever been distrustful of democracy. This, as I said, is a myth. At certain points early in our republic, you couldn't have envisioned certain kinds of national elections because you did not have the national apparatus, whether it's transportation, communication, or national parties that could facilitate elections. Democracy is terrible, except that it's better than everything else. And that adage is nowhere more clear than with regard to faithless electors. Do you even know who any of the electors are? No one knows who these electors are. The last thing in the world I would want to do is give power to people who, I gotta say, in the main, are not even particularly accomplished in most states. It varies, but you don't get to be an elector by being a statesperson and being successful in your career. A lot of electors are nobodies in states, and I'm giving those few hundred people now the power to pick the president. That's even more true in the modern world, where the president does things and has to be able to do things that imperil all of us. He's got the finger on the button. He deals with foreign nations. He picks people to the Supreme Court. Now more than ever, I think it's important for presidents to have electoral legitimacy and accountability. And you ask why it is that the president has so much more power than Congress today. There are really two reasons. At the founding, you heard the term the least dangerous branch. That was a reference to the judiciary. The most dangerous branch at the founding was Congress. It had the power of the purse. Okay? That was big. Today, the most dangerous and most powerful branch is the president. And that's true for two reasons. One is because the world has become a lot smaller place. And you need to respond to crises quickly, decisively, sometimes without public deliberation. Congress is a very ponderous, open body. The executive branch operates in secrecy, as it has to in a lot of instances. The appointment power for the judiciary has become a lot more important in recent generations. So one reason is that the world has changed. But the other reason is that democracy has changed. At the founding, the electors were selected by the state legislatures. It wasn't until the 1820s, 30s, 40s that states began holding popular elections to select electors. Okay? Today, the reason the president has so much more credibility than Congress as an institution is the president had 50, 60, 70 million people support him. How many people voted for Mitch McConnell? Kentucky is a state of 2-3 million people? Maybe 1.5 million registered voters? Maybe 1 million people vote. Maybe McConnell got 600,000 votes. Compare 600,000 to 60 million. Okay? Nancy Pelosi, even fewer. She comes from a House district. 800,000 people, 500,000 voters, maybe 350,000 people vote, 200,000 votes. The president has legitimacy because of electoral processes. And I think we should, if that's the reality, I want to embrace that, not buck it by giving power to unknown people who don't really run on their own. As I said, most states don't even include the names of the electors on the ballot. They include the names of the candidates. And if you read the fine print, it says, when you vote for this person, you're voting for a slate of electors pledged to support that candidate. I want those folks who I don't even know to decide who's a good character. That seems more scary to me than even the way things are now. And happily, we haven't had faithless electors make a difference. We've had a few who don't follow through on their pledge, but it hasn't affected any outcome. And states are experimenting with ways of keeping them in line rather than unleashing them all more.
Well, but Vic, it's a new era out there. If you look around the world today, you see this new model of governance with autocratic leaders, populist movements motivated by hatred in one form or another. This is the context of the New World Order in which people move around. They immigrate from one place to another, raising the question of whether democracy produces a good result in the context of diversity and large-scale immigration from one place to another. So that some people, myself included, have become a little bit more agnostic about whether populism, majoritarianism, without guardrails, is the best form of government.
Well, you can have guardrails. The question is whether the Electoral College is the right kind of guardrail. You could have a guardrail that says, for example, no one can become president unless they have a minimum of 30% support in every state of the country. The anti-regionalism point. There's ways of building in some safeguards. We don't have them today. You talk about the modern world. And I'm not disparaging the current occupant of the White House, but to the extent that we have someone, a president, who is more prone to those pressures you identified, that's a product of the Electoral College, not a product of. And although Trump may be right that he could have won the popular vote, I was giving him some credit for saying that we don't know for sure. I wouldn't bet that he would have won the popular vote no matter what happened. I would have bet that the Democrat would have won the popular vote. And so, it's not clear to me. I understand the problem you're posing. I just don't understand how this is the right choice.
Okay, I'll let you have last word there. I want to go to other questions here. Potential defects of your proposal for a national election of the president. What is the delayed outcome problem? In 2016, it was 3 weeks before we knew that Hillary Clinton had won the election by the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. It isn't safe. It took that long in order to get a vote count that had some reasonable degree of credibility. And if we were to have a direct election of the president, would 3 weeks be too long, create too much crisis? And if a recount was required, God forbid, would it be a full recount of all 50 states in the District of Columbia, or only a partial recount? And if it were either way, wouldn't that lead back to Florida, where you have states, doing recounts based upon different rules in different states? And wouldn't that then lead to a partisan Supreme Court declaring the outcome of the election with detriment to the credibility of the Supreme Court as well as the credibility of the White House and the eventual winner?
So I think there's a lot of questions bound up in that package. So let's separate them out. First of all, it may take a while to know the margin of national victory, but it doesn't take a while to know that someone clearly won the national popular vote. So take 2000 or even 2016. In 2000, it was clear that Al Gore won the national vote, even though it took a long time to do recounting here in Florida. In 2004, if Ohio had been closer, we would have had the same problem in Ohio that we had in Florida 4 years prior, and yet it would have been clear that W would have won the national popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote. We knew that a day or two after the election. So it's a second, technology should be able to give us results more quick. Big states do recounts all the time. New York does recounts. California does recounts. California's 40 million people. This is not a small town. And we can handle it, so nationally it can happen. Notice that in some elections, a national popular vote would create more of a recount issue because you'd have to do a national recount if it were a close national election. But in most elections where the national outcome is not close, we don't care who won Ohio or Florida. We don't have to do any of these silly recounts. The other question, though, that was packaged into your bundle has to do with disuniformity in the way votes are tabulated, the ballots in different states. Here's where I diverge from the NPV folks. They took a lot of our ideas, but they didn't take all of my brothers and my ideas. And we said in our early writings that there has to be more uniformity in the ballot and the way the ballots are counted for you to get a credible national count. So we would have said that states that sign on to NPV should also sign on to a model or template ballot and some rules about who gets to vote. You got to be 18, blah, blah, blah. Do rehabilitated felons get to vote or not? There has to be some kind of similarity between the ballots that are used across. Right now, you don't care about that because ballots aren't being compared across state lines. When they are going to be compared across state lines, you should be comparing apples to apples. That's why, it's one of the many reasons that I think if they get to 270 and Congress has the power and the obligation to step in and avoid disarray by passing a national law that would provide a national preference poll. You don't have to call it an election. A national preference poll with a standardized ballot and standardized rules about who gets to participate, done in all 50 states, so as to give information about who really is the most popular candidate in the entire country to those states that have signed on to MPV and allow them to allocate their electors according to the results of this uniform, standardized national preference poll. Congress has the power to do that. There's complicated legal arguments, but if anyone's interested, I wrote an article a handful of years ago in the Georgetown Law Journal that lays out why Congress has the power to do that. Right now, it's not a right question because we're not close to 270. But if you get some red states on board and it looks like that's in the offing, then Congress should really begin to turn its attention to that possibility.
Yes, and you convinced me in your writing that Congress has the power to do that. My question is whether they would have the will to do that.
And maybe they wouldn't. So another option is for the states that have signed on to the NPV to cure the mistake that they made by not listening to me, my brother, and me earlier, and going back and repassing an NPV with a more uniform agreement about what those states, and once those states all agree to something uniform, then that's going to put tremendous pressure on Congress and the other states to do something to play ball.
By the way, your brother is your biggest competition for nominations in the Supreme Court. You are his.
We're both too old, unfortunately.
But good luck.
Yeah.
A similar question about potential defects of the proposed solution here. And that's what you yourself call the low plurality problem. With the Electoral College protects the two-party system. So we have third-party candidates who get some percentage of the national vote, but they never win a whole state. And consequently, they don't get any Electoral College votes. And so that makes it irrational to have third parties in American politics. But with a direct national election, that's not the case. So you may have the spoiler effect of a third or fourth party, and that in turn could lead to a situation of a plurality winner with maybe as little as 37% of the vote. And then comes the question of whether to have a recount or not. Well, okay, that might be a solution on paper, but that's a pretty difficult road to hoe here. So what's your response there about the potential danger of a low plurality victor and the need for a recount? And how would you work around that?
It's a red herring. It's an entirely red herring. You know, you're a political scientist. You could confirm for me. When you have third parties that have clout, it's in multi-member bodies like Parliament, where seats are allocated in proportion to how strong each party is in the national showing. when you have a single winner in a single congressional district or a governorship or a president, single first past the post voting rules, you don't have third-party problems for governorships in California, Texas, and New York. You have more third-party problems in presidential elections than you do in the governorships. In California, you don't worry about third parties. The governors of California typically have a higher winning percentage than the presidents do of the national popular vote. So it's a red herring, and if you were worried about it, you could solve it by something you and I have talked about, transferable voting, instant runoff election, where you throw out the person who got the fewest votes and recycle the people who voted for them by saying, well, who would they have voted for? And that gets a little complicated for some people to understand. I don't think you have to worry about it, but you could, if you were really worried, that would be the solution.
If all America was California, we probably wouldn't need this.
You look at other instances that don't have parliamentary systems, they don't have third-party problems. And states are the best comparators to look at when looking at the presidency. No state emulates the Electoral College. No state has third-party problems in their governorship. So why would we think if 40 million Californians or 30 million Floridians or 30 million New Yorkers or 33 million Texans, if they don't suffer, why would it be true at the national level? There's no reason.
I'm going to ask the last question for now, so that's a signal to whoever's going to set up the mic for the questions from the floor. And Nick, I'd like for you to speak to at least one of the other proposals for addressing the problem, the winner-take-all problem. There's probably a lot of people in the room know, Nebraska and Maine, they have a system whereby they allocate their electoral college vote based on congressional districts, award them proportionately. That would be a way of kind of disaggregating the electorate as opposed to re-aggregating it, as you want to do, to create a national electorate. Why not that solution? The League of Women Voters go around to the states and encourage states to do as those two states have done and just award their votes proportionate to the performance of the candidates in those electoral colleges. Okay, you got the problem with the two senators, but that could be the bonus 2 votes for the candidates with the state of the whole. Why not that?
So, several problems with moving away from winner-take-all. Again, it's rational for every state to use winner-take-all because it enhances its own voice. But if a state said, okay, we want to be selfless and we want to move away from winner-take-all and some kind of proportional allocation, if you do it according to congressional districts, like some states have done, that doesn't really help at all because you could have lopsided. You can win one district 51-49 and lose the other district 90-10, and you get the same number of electors. So it doesn't remotely count votes equally within a state, let alone across the country. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2, and I'll just leave it at this so we can get to some other questions, is for that to work, that would have to be done nationwide. If some states go away from winner-take-all and others don't, that's a recipe for partisan gamesmanship. In fact, the biggest movement to get a state to move away from winner-take-all is always done in anticipation of who's going to lose the next presidential election. And so in 2008, Democrats in Colorado, fearful that they're going to lose all of Colorado's 9 electors, they propose to go proportional so that they'll only lose 4 out of the 9 rather than all 9. Pennsylvania, the other way around. When it looks like it's going red, when it's going to go blue, the Republican leaders push a plan to divide Pennsylvania along proportional lines so that you don't lose entirely, you just lose half. That, again, if that were done from on high, that may be okay, but you still have the problem of each congressional district has a lot of people, and we're not counting all of them the same way. If every how about this? Every congressional district has 1 person. And we allocate electors based on every congressional district. Hey, what do we call that? We call that a national election. Right? Why do we need to play games when that's the goal?
Okay, questions from the audience.